It's time now for some political analysis from our panel. Susan Page is the Washington Bureau Chief of USA Today. Lonnie Chen is a Republican policy advisor and fellow at the Hoover Institution. Dan Balls is chief correspondent at the Washington Post, and Jamelle Bouie is the CBS News political analyst and a columnist with the New York Times. Good to have you all here. Lonnie, I want to start on the fundamental basis of what is central to our democracy, which is that our election process actually works. And undermining faith in the integrity of the election is a massive risk. I think everyone can agree on that. What we have heard in the past few days, I think, is frankly confusing. And National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien said not just that he had not seen the underlying intelligence that Russia was intervening with a preference for Trump, but also that he had never received a briefing to that effect. He also told us in our interview that the FBI did tell him that Russia was intervening to help Sanders. This morning, Trump says he was never told that. What should Americans at home understand from this? Because bottom line, isn't the National Security Advisor's job to say our elections will be protected no matter who is interfering and no matter whom they're interfering on behalf of?
Yeah, look, I think he said that at the end. I think he made the point that regardless of who's doing this or what they might be trying to do, it is the job of this administration to protect the integrity of the election process and the integrity of our democratic process. But, you know, I think some of the confusion that's arising is because they're trying to turn things on very specific indications of what did and did not happen. For example, the administration is saying that the president may not have been briefed on the underlying intelligence. But surely the president was provided with some interpretation, perhaps, of that data. And so what they're trying to say maybe is that he hasn't seen the underlying evidence. Now, that may be true. Which is not unusual. Which is not unusual, and that may be true. But I think what we really could benefit from here is some clarity in terms of exactly what the intelligence community is seeing. If they are helping Bernie Sanders, and that is an assessment that they are comfortable with, I think that's something that should be shared. And if there's any confusion, I do think that O'Brien's point was right, which is the underlying intelligence ought to be declassified so we can see that. The American people.
That was my point.
Your point. I'm sorry.
He said he couldn't do that.
Good point then, because then that will give the American people some comfort about what's actually going on. I do think there's confusion right now. There's no question that there's confusion right now.
Yeah. You know who benefits from confusion? Russia. Because if they may want Trump reelected, they may want Sanders nominated and elected. What they mostly want is for us not to believe that we're going to have a free and fair election that we can trust. And they are succeeding on that front.
And Dan, it was your paper, The Washington Post, that reported Russia is attempting to help Sanders' presidential campaign as part of an effort to interfere with the Democratic contest. What is unusual is to have the National Security Advisor talk about this in a political context. And there was reaction to O'Brien commenting in this way. It's unusual for someone in that position to do so.
Well, it's not just unusual, it's supposedly not allowed. I mean, the National Security Advisor is supposed to be an official who's dealing only in the national security realm and not involved in partisan politics. And so any suggestion or anything that comes from him that puts him into that realm undermines the role that he's supposed to be playing.
Jamelle, I mean, the theory of the case here, as Susan was saying, is that division, confusion, that's the end game in and of itself. It's not having the Manchurian candidate per se. Right. It's just getting people to doubt that the systems and institutions are actually functioning. Can Democrats form a united front here, or are they falling prey to some of this? Because you heard it bubble up a little bit in that Biden interview as well, where he said, I don't buy that these are, you know, Russian bots interfering and spreading hate online, that Senator Sanders is responsible for some of it.
I think the first step Democrats have to do is do what Senator Sanders said when he was told or was asked to comment publicly about this, to disavow the interference, to say that if he's elected president, he will reject anything like this and try to stop any kind of election interference into the country. And then as far as the entire Democratic Party goes, I think there needs to be sort of two things going on. First, yes, an awareness that online and other forums there may be Russian hackers, trolls trying to stir up things, but it's probably not wise to immediately lean on that as your explanation. For the specific reason that it does undermine people's faith in what's happening. On the question of online division, maybe that does require all candidates, right, to say anyone in our camp doing these things needs to cut it out, which is what the candidates have been saying. But I would recommend specifically for this problem of maintaining faith in the process to not immediately jump to, well, it's Russian bots, it's Russian hackers, because that, I think, does sow mistrust and a little bit of fear.
Well, one of the things that makes Sanders, a candidate who is controversial, certainly starkly in contrast to Joe Biden and what he describes there, is also some of his rhetoric. He tweeted and got some guff for it this week. I've got news for the Republican establishment. I've got news for the Democratic establishment. They can't stop us. That was seen as not a message of unity for the party, but one of this is an insurgency,
right,
which is divisive.
It is divisive. I'm not sure. I guess my perspective on these sorts of things is informed by previous election cycles, which is compared to some of the language that emerged in 2016 or 2008 or 2004. It's not that divisive, right? I distinctly remember in the 2008 Democratic primary, the candidates Clinton and Obama throwing extremely hard punches at each other, saying things that in the moment made it feel like there may not be unity once the primary ended. But what happened was unity. The party got back together. So Sanders calling out the Republican establishment, the Democratic establishment, that's sort of been his brand as a national politician. And I don't think relative to past contests or even relative to this contest is all that divisive. I see this as just part of everyone's brand management when it comes to the role they're playing in this primary.
I mean, I think it's quite divisive in the sense that he's speaking to his base. That's who he's communicating to. He's communicating to his supporters. And we've seen this movie before, by the way, in terms of how candidates communicate with the people who support them. His message is to his supporters to say, look, you've been ignored, you've been marginalized, no longer I will be your voice. I alone can do this. We've heard this rhetoric before. So I think it is incredibly divisive for Senator Sanders to engage in that. And the Democratic establishment needs to wake up on this. If they're going to stop Bernie Sanders, or they're going to figure out some way to make sure he isn't the nominee, that needs to start today. Not after South Carolina, not after Super Tuesday. It needs to start today. And by the way, Mike Bloomberg could easily engage in this activity. He could turn all of his advertising against Bernie Sanders tomorrow if he wanted to. And that's the only way there's a difference made in this race, I think.
It's true, though. It may be divisive or not, but it is an accurate depiction of what we see happening. And you mentioned kind of the eerie parallels to the 2016 race on the Republican side, where you had a very controversial candidate. You had a wide field that was much more acceptable to the party establishment that fought with each other and divided the other side of and it created this path for Donald Trump to win the nomination. And that is what we see now happening, I think, with the Democrats and with Bernie Sanders. And the only comfort for Democrats, I think, is a lot of Democrats don't think Bernie Sanders can win a national election. A lot of Republicans didn't think Donald Trump could either last time around.
I think.
Well, Joe Biden, Dan, is making the argument for the good of the party that someone like him, he'd prefer him, should be the candidate, not just for the Oval Office, but because of all the down ballot races, essentially warning that Democrats are going to lose all leverage or influence or a majority, certainly in the House, if they don't go with a more establishment candidate.
Right, and that argument is going to be amped up this week in South Carolina and ahead of Super Tuesday. But to your point about the Democratic establishment needs to get together, we saw in 2016 that there is no way that an establishment, quote unquote, within a party can do that. I mean, what it requires is sacrifice on the part of candidates who are now in the race to say, you know what, for the good of the cause, I'm going to step aside. Well, which among these candidates is going to do that other than people who perform so woefully in South Carolina and Super Tuesday that they're essentially driven out of the race?
Well, we got that call this week from Mike Bloomberg, Jamal, in that leaked memo.
Right. I can't imagine the kinds of people who run for president, right, are not the kinds of people who are going to say to themselves, well, I guess for the good of the party and the someone else's political prospects, I'm going to drop out to make sure that this candidate I don't think can win. I think it's worth saying in that regards that the analogy to Trump falls apart when it comes to Trump's favorability within the Republican Party at this stage of the race. Sanders, at the last poll I saw, 76% of Democrats have a favorable view of Sanders. That's higher than any other candidate in the race. And for all the talk of reconstituting the Obama coalition, which has kind of been the drumbeat among Democrats for the past 3 years, Sanders seems to be the one doing it, right? We saw this in Nevada, pulling together a coalition of union households, of minority voters, of working class voters, of young voters, into something that looks like potentially an electoral juggernaut. So I sort of think the certainty among the Democratic establishment, such that it is, that Sanders is unelectable, runs into the fact that looking at what we know so far, he appears to be quite electable based on the measures we use for everyone else.
Lonnie, I want to ask you about someone you know who you worked with in a prior campaign, and that is Rick Rennell, the current ambassador to Germany who has stepped into the Director of National Intelligence role. He has no intelligence background. What do you think of his appointment to that job at this moment?
Well, you know, the president puts people around him who he's comfortable with, who he believes will be loyal to him. The president has that prerogative, by the way. You know, it's not clear to me that this is going to be the permanent appointment. I would say that there are a number of people who probably would be a better permanent appointment than Rick Rennell. But look, he has national security experience, not like he doesn't have any at all. You're right, he doesn't have any intelligence community experience. So I think at this point in time, the president might be better served with someone who has that experience. But to me, this is a reflection of how the president has staffed his administration all along.